Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for itself, Chapter 7, First Subdivision of Logic, the Science of Being, Quasi-Subdivision B, Quantity, Infra-Subdivision Alpha, Pure Quantity, Subsection C, Degree, recorded directly on my Motorola phone. It is a stylish G. Subsection C, Encyclopedia section 103. The limit in a quantum is identical with the whole of the quantum itself. As in itself multiple, the limit is extensive magnitude, as in itself simple determinateness, qualitative simplicity, it is intensive magnitude or degree. The distinction between continuous and discrete magnitude differs from that between extensive and intensive in the circumstance that the former apply to quantity in general, while the latter apply to the limit or determinateness of it as such. Intensive and extensive magnitude are not, any more than the other, two species, of which the one involves a character not possessed by the other. What is extensive magnitude is just as much intensive and vice versa. Intensive magnitude or degree is in its notion distinct from extensive magnitude or the quantum. It is therefore inadmissible to refuse, as many do, to recognize this distinction and without scruple to identify the two forms of magnitude. They are so identified in physics. When difference of specific gravity is explained by saying that a body with a specific gravity twice that of another contains within the same space twice as many material parts or atoms as the other. An example of this, as an aside, when you have a crystal, say you have an emerald. An emerald has a specific gravity called a mole, MOL, of about 4 on a scale of 1 to 8, 8 being the hardest, 1 being softest, I believe. And a diamond would have a mole of around 7. But a piece of quartz may have a specific gravity or mole of 2. So once again, they are so identified in physics when difference of specific gravity is explained by saying that a body with a specific gravity twice that of another contains within the same space twice as many material parts or atoms as the other. So with heat and light, if the various degrees of temperature and brilliancy were to be explained by the greater or less number of particles or molecules of heat and light, no doubt the physicists who employ such a mode of explanation usually excuse themselves when they are remonstrated with on its untenableness by saying that the expression is without prejudice to the confessedly unknowable essence of such phenomena and employed merely for greater convenience. The phenomena mentioned here is not the molecules contained, but the type of light or heat which is pushed through the crystal. And in modern physics, or in Newtonian physics, we should say, the type of light that goes through a particular crystal is as important to distinguish what that crystal might be able to do. This greater convenience is meant to point to the easier application of the calculus, but it is hard to see why intensive magnitudes having, as they do, a definite numerical expression of their own should not be as convenient for calculation as extensive magnitudes. If convenience be all that is desired, surely it would be more convenient to banish calculation and thought altogether. A further point against the apology offered by the physicists is that to engage in explanations of this kind is to overstep the sphere of perception and experience and resort to the realm of metaphysics and of what at other times would be called idle or even pernicious speculation. It is certainly a fact of experience that if one of two purses filled with shillings is twice as heavy as the other, the reason must be that one contains, say, 200, and the other only 100 shillings. These pieces of money we can see and feel with our senses. Atoms, molecules, and the like are on the contrary beyond the range of sensuous perception, and thought alone can decide whether they are admissible and have a meaning. But as already noticed in Encyclopedia section 98, and note, it is abstract understanding which stereotypes the factor of motiety, which, according to Wiktionary, motiety means the quality of being many, from Latin multos, much or many. But it is abstract understanding which stereotypes the factor of motiety involved in the notion of being for itself, or being for self. But it is abstract understanding which stereotypes the factor of motiety involved in the notion of being for self, in the shape of atoms, and adopts it as an ultimate principle. It is the same abstract understanding which, in the present instance, at equal variance with unprejudiced perception and with real concrete thought, regards extensive magnitude as the sole form of quantity, and where intensive magnitudes occur, does not recognize them in their own character, but makes a violent attempt by a wholly untenable hypothesis to reduce them to extensive magnitudes. Among the charges made against modern philosophy, one is heard more than another. Modern philosophia, it is said, reduces everything to identity, hence its nickname, the philosophy of identity. But the present discussion may teach that it is philosophy, and philosophy alone, which insists on distinguishing what is logically as well as in experience different, while the professed devotees of experience are the people who erect abstract identity into the chief principle of knowledge. It is their philosophy which might more appropriately be termed one of identity. Besides, it is quite correct that there are no mere extensive and merely intensive magnitudes, just as little as there are merely continuous and merely discrete magnitudes. The two characteristics of quantity are not opposed as independent kinds. every intensive magnitude is also extensive and vice versa. Thus, a certain degree of temperature is an intensive magnitude which has a perfectly simple sensation corresponding to it as such. If we look at the thermometer, we find this degree of temperature has a certain expansion of the column of mercury corresponding to it, which extensive magnitude changes simultaneously with the temperature or intensive magnitude. The case is similar in the world of mind. A more intensive character has a wider range with its effects than a less intensive. So, to take the example of a thermometer, as most people now use some digital reading based in a thermometer somewhere else to determine degree, a classic thermometer used the element mercury, which is considered quite dangerous to work with, and definitely you shouldn't ingest it. But it is a metal, and that metal increased if it were placed in a vessel with a bowl at the bottom, and then above the bowl, all in glass or plastic, a thin line, equally thin line going up, where the bowl of mercury would be forced into that line. As it became warmer, the mercury would rise and would stay at the place where it rose if the temperature outside were the same, and it would fall as the temperature fell, all the way down to, we imagine, zero, all the way up to however much mercury there is to sustain it. Someone at some point calculated degrees, because every degree system is different, whether it be Celsius or Fahrenheit or kelvins. These are the general degree systems that exist. So you would say right now outside it is 38 degrees Fahrenheit. This is just a bit above freezing. So the mercury, sensitive even to that level of cold, would rise up just a bit so it could detect 38 degrees. Or if it is 38 degrees Celsius, for instance, it would rise much higher. 38 degrees Celsius is about 76 degrees Fahrenheit. So it would also rise to show you that it's 78 degrees outside. That's actually, or probably a bit warmer than that. Pardon, that would be almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The trick is to multiply, so to double the degrees Celsius and add 25, generally gets you transition into Fahrenheit. So you would use mercury. Since mercury was considered dangerous to use, now people will use maybe water. Water has a known boiling point and a known freezing point, and so they'll use colored water that would also force its way up as this temperature rose. Basically, the molecules would become they would be farther away from each other, and as the molecules are farther away from each other, they seek more room to expand into. And as they become colder, they draw closer to each other and they seek less room. So, as it relates to the case and similar in the world of mind, a more intensive character has a wider range with its effects than a less intensive. If your molecular structure, if your atoms are more in your mind, let's say you have more information stored in the random access memory and the hard drive memory of your brain than someone else, it may take a bit longer for it to expand outward and become warm. So if you have a lot of information in your brain stored, uh, it will take longer for heat to transfer through it to, let's say, cause you to become angry than if you have less information stored in your random access memory or mind. Then it will be easier for heat to transfer through it and make you angry. But say you become angry and you have a lot of information in your mind, it may take longer for you to cool off and become calm again as a result. So, just the nature of your mind, what it knows, and what its capacity is, and how much that capacity is filled. Capacity can be measured in intellectual quotient, which is measured not in percentages but in percentiles. So the average American, on a scale of 100 to 200, the average American has an intellectual quotient of 80. The average university graduate, a person working in government or as a teacher or a number of other places, just as maybe an elementary school teacher or somewhere else. And again, this isn't exclusive, all types of people work in these areas would have an average IQ or intellectual quotient of 90 to 110. And this is a great range. Let's say the average person studying and understanding Hegel or studying physics or something of that nature would have an intellectual quotient of about 120 or higher than that. And it said that Einstein had an intellectual quotient of 160, which is quite high. If you imagine the average school teacher or government worker, very smart people doing amazing work, are between 90 and 110, then Einstein was at 160. That's about where he was. So this is one way to see how degree works. Degrees are different than basic numbers. It really depends on what the capacity. So these are capacities. So to have an IQ of 110 doesn't mean that you have complete access to all of it. You may not have enough cash, CACHE or CASH, to access your entire intellectual quotient. So though you have an intellectual quotient of 110 or 160, it may be that you don't have enough. So I have a laptop, let's say, with a capacity of 50 gigabytes, or if you want to keep with our similar numbers, let's say you have a laptop with a capacity of 160 gigabytes. I know many people are in terabytes at this point, but 160 gigabytes, but you only have stored on it 40 gigabytes. So you're not using the full capacity of your laptop, and many people had said do not use the full capacity of their intellectual quotient. So even those very, very smart people, or at least those people who have a high potential to be smart, often do not use their full intellectual quotient, because to do so, one has to establish a program to program yourself to accept information, and to process it in a particular way. I recommend going to Google, which uses an algorithm. Let's say you have a Chrome account, or some other way you have a Google account. I have a Gmail account, and which I use for YouTube. I use for my Google Drive, for my Chrome browser, to link these things together. So you have that account. Regularly type in questions. You can ask it in a form of a question. You may want to type in keywords Go out and ask questions. You may also want to just speak to Google and do it that way. And I say Google specifically because the Alphabet Company has an algorithm, an intellectual quotient of its own that can separate out for you almost a personal sub algorithm. So the more questions you ask on the same account, the more it gets to know you and know the type of things you're looking for and even make suggestions. And it'll do that across the board and in YouTube and even in your email system or other places. And you will begin working with a universal computer. Not only, I know they have something called a D-Wave computer, which is called a quantum computer, as we're discussing here. And it would be better, just because of politics, to call it a quantum computation machine that's able to work with their algorithm. And they may have a supercomputer running artificial intelligence. And that artificial intelligence is really an intelligence that mimics a human mind. That artificial intelligence is said to have about an IQ of 80. And so of kind of an average human being, but a high capacity to work with you. So it will present information at an IQ level of 80, which is about where you want if you're going to present information to other people, and it'll provide that for you. Or so this is something to do, and if you do this over an extended period of time, I've done it since attending law school, where I learned to do formal research on really any topic that could ever be in front of a judge, and that I would have to argue in front of a judge, or if I were a judge to make a decision on. The more you interact with it, even asking for music lyrics or things like that, the more it gets to know you. So instead of keeping all of these processes in your own mind, you can have some of them in your Google account, and it interacts with your capacity. So I have, as tested here in California when I was about 9 years old, an intellectual quotient of between 140 to 144. And I don't have a very good random access memory. I seem to have a good long-term memory, but not a very good random access memory. And so to supplement a poor random access memory, I use Google to remember the type of things that I normally look for quickly, and then to call them up. And so that's how I've supplemented. So I would say, even though I have a 140 to 144 IQ, I may be working at a much lower IQ level from a day-to-day basis, even if my long-term projects are at a higher level. But I supplement that to at least reach my full capacity with Google to call up my random access memory, even if my random access memory will be at an 80 IQ level, which is fine, to just talk to people right away. So these are ways that you can program your experience with the world without necessarily having to have a formal programming background. Consider law school if you want to learn to do research this way as well. Even a year of law school, and some schools like UCLA have, I think, master's degrees where you can think like an attorney. You'll get some of these skills there as well to take with you into your courses. Okay, going back to the reading. Encyclopedia section 104. In degree, the notion of quantum is explicitly put. It is magnitude as indifferent on its own account and simple, but in such a way that the character or modal being which makes it a quantum lies quite outside it in other magnitudes. In this contradiction, where the independent indifferent limit is absolute externality, the infinite quantitative progression infinite quantitative progression, a token, the infinite quantitative progression is made explicit, an immediacy which immediately veers round into its counterparts, into mediation, the passing beyond and over the quantum just laid down, and vice versa. Number is a thought, but thought in its complete self-externalization, because it is a thought, ayat, it does not allow, number is a thought, ayah, but thought in its complete self-externalization. Because it is a thought, it does not belong to perception, but it is a thought which is characterized by the externality of perception. Not only, therefore, may the quantum be increased or diminished without end, the very notion of quantum is thus to push out and out beyond itself. The infinite quantitative progression is only the meaningless repetition of one and the same contradiction, which attaches to the quantum both generally and when explicitly invested with its special character as degree. Touching the futility of enunciating this contradiction in the form of infinite progression, Zenu, as quoted by Aristotle, rightly says, it is the same to say a thing once and to say it forever. It is the same, one, to say a thing once, and two, to say it forever. Encyclopedia, paragraph, section 104, infrasection 1. If we follow the usual definition of the mathematicians given in Encyclopedia section 99, and say that magnitude is what can be increased or diminished, there may be nothing to urge against the correctness of the perception on which it is founded, but the question remains how we come to assume such a capacity of increase or diminution. If we simply appeal for an answer to experience, we try an unsatisfactory course. Because apart from the fact that we should merely have a material image of magnitude and not the thought of it, magnitude would come out as a bare possibility of increasing or diminishing, and we should have no key to the necessity for its exhibiting this behavior. In the way of our logical evolution, on the contrary, quantity is obviously a grade, the process of self-determining thought, and it has been shown that it lies in the very notion of quantity to shoot out beyond itself. In that way, the increase or diminution of which we have heard is not merely possible, but necessary. So, an example, we should be able to say that sunset is magnificently beautiful. We should not be able to say, now it is more beautiful than it was a moment ago. Wait, no, more but now less beautiful. We can say that sunset is magnificently beautiful. Do you see the red and the magenta flowing into the, is that a violet? Are those hints of yellow and orange? So you go from saying magnificently beautiful, which is a magnitude, magnificent, and beautiful, a quality, to explaining the quantities, and each light, each color has a quantitative amplitude, as a wave, you began to then say which you count them: red, magenta, orange, or red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And each has a wavelength. And so when you call red, when you call orange, you're really talking about their quantity. But we shouldn't go on and when we discuss quality, it would be better to give an initial statement of quality of a specific, and then to quantify it for a person who wants to then understand it. Encyclopedia section 104, infra section 2. The quantitative infinite progression is what the reflective understanding usually relies upon when it is engaged with the general question of infinity. The same thing, however, holds good of this progression, as was already remarked on the occasion of the qualitatively infinite progression. As was then said, it is not the expression of a true, but of a wrong infinity. It never gets further than a bare ought, and thus really remains within the limits of finitude. The quantitative form of this infinite progression, which Spinoza rightly calls a mere imaginary infinity, infinitum imaginationis, is an image often employed by poets, such as Hegel and Klopstock, to depict the infinite, not of nature merely, but even of God himself. Thus we find Hegel in a famous description of God's infinity saying,
Ich häufe ungeheure Zahlen, Gebirge Millionen.
I'm going to start that again.
Ich häufe ungeheure Zahlen, Gebirge Millionen auf, ich setze Zeit auf Zeit und Welt auf Welt zuhauf, und wenn ich von der grausen Höh mit Schwindel wieder nach dir seh, ist alle Macht der Zahl vermehrt zu 1000-mal noch nicht ein Teil von dir.
Thank you. Translate that google.com. Then I will read the translation here, and then I will read the translation provided by William Wallace. I accumulate enormous numbers, mountains, millions up. I sit time on time, and heaps of world upon world. And when I come down from the dreadful height, checking on you again with dizziness, is all my power of numbers multiplied 1,000 times not a part of you yet? And William Wallace's translation: I heap up monstrous numbers, mountains of millions. I pile time upon time, and world on top of. Once again, I heap up monstrous numbers, mountains of millions. I pile time upon time, and world on the top of world. And when from the awful height I cast a dizzy look towards thee, all the power of number, multiplied 1,000 times, is not yet one part of thee. It is possible this particular poem references a famous and I believe repeated set of verses in the Quran, the Islamic holy book, and I believe also a later transmission of the Egyptian book of Going Thy Way by Night and Day, which says, if all of the seas were ink, and they multiplied 7 times over. And if every tree was a pin, and again they multiplied 7 times over, they would not begin to exhaust the word of my God. Continuing with the text. Here then we meet, in the first place, that continual extrusion of quantity, and especially, here then we meet, in the first place, that continual extrusion of quantity, and especially of number, beyond itself, which Kant describes as eerie. And Einstein would say spooky action at a distance. The only really eerie thing about it is the wearisomeness of ever fixing and non-unfixing a limit without advancing a single step. The same poet, however, well adds to the description of false infinity the closing line. And remember, false means other than true, not that it doesn't exist. Truth in our text is equivalent to God. Anything that is not truth or God is false, but in its falsity, we are able to determine an emanation from the truth, whether or not they are connected, depending on your philosophy. So the final line of the poem.
Ich zieh sie ab, und du liegst ganz vor mir. Ich zieh sie ab, und du liegst ganz vor mir.
And the translation provided here on Google Translate. I pull them off, and you're all in front of me. But the translation provided by William Wallace. These I remove, and thou liest all before me. Which means that the true infinite is more than a mere world beyond the finite, and that we, in order to become conscious of it, must renounce that progressus in infinitum. With Ana Maratul Habibi, with the understanding that I am the mirror of my beloved. So to see infinity, one must look in a mirror and know that it is not the mirror that is the negation, but the one who looks in the mirror. The mirror is truth in our philosophical sense. The mirror, I should say, the reflection in the mirror is truth. The mirror itself is the false infinity, and the one looking into the mirror is the negation of truth. That's how I would explain it. Encyclopedia section 104. Infra section 3. Pythagoras, as is well known, philosophized in numbers and conceived number as the fundamental principle of things. To the ordinary mind, this view must at first glance seem an utter paradox, perhaps a mere craze. What, then, are we to think of it? To answer this question, we must, in the first place, remember that the problem of philosophy consists in tracing back things to thoughts, and of course, to definite thoughts. Now, number is undoubtedly a thought. It is the thought nearest the sensible, or more precisely expressed, it is the thought of the sensible itself. If we take the sensible to mean what is many and in reciprocal exclusion, the attempt to apprehend the universe as number is therefore the first step to metaphysics. The attempt to apprehend the universe as number is therefore the first step to metaphysics. And what is metaphysics in this context? So I often look at the abbreviation VIZ period, viz, sometimes people say, or I say vis-a-vis, and instead of saying viz or vis-a-vis, I'll say appears as, or seems to be, or mirrors, or reflects, or looks. So that word viz, and this is why Hegel has left it that way, and I imagine William Wallace, because the word, you know the word in the context of the sentence. So what does the attempt to apprehend the universe as number is therefore the attempt to apprehend the universe as number is therefore the first step to metaphysics. Physics is the examination of the false infinite in its reflection, or in its ability to show the negative infinite, the positive infinite. So physics is where we learn how things work. Metaphysics is when we put them to work for ourselves in this context. So by learning that the universe is number, one can then use those numbers to cause things to occur. In the history of philosophy, Pythagoras, as we know, stands between the Ionian philosophers and the Eleatics, while the former, as Aristotle says, never get beyond viewing the essence of things as material, in Greek, ili, and the latter, especially Parmenides, advanced as far as pure thought in the shape of being. The principle of the Pythagorean philosophy forms, as it were, the bridge from the sensible to the supersensible. We may gather from this what is to be said of those who suppose that Pythagoras undoubtedly went too far when he conceived the essence of things as mere number. It is true, they admit, that we can number things, but they contend things are far more than mere numbers. But in what respect are they more? The ordinary sensuous consciousness, from its own point of view, would not hesitate to answer the question by handing us over to sensuous perception and remarking that things are not merely numerable, but also visible, odorous, palpable, and the like. In the phrase of modern times, the fault of Pythagoras would be described as an excess of idealism, as may be gathered from what has been said on the historical position of the Pythagorean school. The real state of the case is quite the reverse. Let it be conceded that things are more than numbers, but the meaning of that admission must be that the bare thought of number is still insufficient to enunciate the definite notion or essence of things. Instead, then, of saying that Pythagoras went too far with his philosophy of number, it would be nearer the truth to say that he did not go far enough. And in fact, the Eleatics were the first to take the further step to pure thought. Besides, even if there are not things, there are states of things and phenomena of nature altogether, the character of which mainly rests on definite numbers and proportions. This is especially the case with the difference of tones and their harmonic concord, which, according to the well-known tradition, first suggested to Pythagoras to conceive the essence of things as number, though it is unquestionably important to science to trace back these phenomena to the definite numbers on which they are based, it is wholly inadmissible to view the characterization by thought as a whole as merely numerical. We may certainly feel ourselves prompted to associate the most general characteristics of thought with the first numbers, saying 1 is the simple and immediate, 2 is difference and mediation, and 3 the unity of both of these. Such associations, however, are purely external. There is nothing in the mere numbers to make them express these definite thoughts. With every step in this method, the more arbitrary grows the association of definite numbers with definite thoughts. And I have a dispute with this in just a second. Thus, we may view 4 as the unity of 1 and 3, and of the thoughts associated with them. But 4 is just as much a double of 2. Similarly, 9 is not merely the square of 3, but also the sum of 8 and 1, of 7 and 2, and so on. To attach, as do some secret societies of modern times, importance to all sorts of numbers and figures is to some extent an innocent amusement, but it is also a sign of deficiency of intellectual resource. These numbers, it is said, conceal a profound meaning and suggest a deal to think about. But the point in philosophy is not what you may think, but what you do think. And the genuine air of thought is to be sought in thought itself, and not in arbitrarily selected symbols. I wanted to wait to the end to see if where Hegel was going with it. So my comment will be briefer. Every number begins as a line. So let's say you draw a line 3 inches long, straight on a piece of paper that goes from bottom to top. Then, so that line we would recognize as the number, cipher, 0. Then you take a part of that line and bend it over. It has now one angle. That one angle equals the number 1. If you were to bend it again, keeping the first angle, you have the number 2. If you continue to bend it, every time you create a new angle, you have a new number. So you have the origin 0, and then you have one angle, then you say you have another line, then you have 2 angles in it, and another line, 3 angles in it. That's 1, 2, and 3. And then if you were to add the angles together on the piece of paper, then you have 1 plus 2 plus 3. And you have 6 angles, and you have 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. This is a geometric proof. Some people know if you were to then loop around the line and connect it together, say you create it from that one long 3-inch line, you brought it to meet itself, it would appear to be a circle, but it may not. But it could also form different shapes. It could form, we would say, a triangle, a square, a pentagon, heptagon, or it would form larger numbers, and in different ways it can be made into 3-dimensional shapes. So Pythagoras was the one who said there is humming within the strings there are hummings within the silvery strings or the strings of light, and there's music in the space between the spheres. Or oh, I apologize. He said there is geometry in the humming strings, and there is music in the space between the spheres. So the geometry is formed when the humming moves around. You'll see that it creates angles. And the more humming that's sustained, we would say it has a wavelength and amplitude of a certain amount. From there, you create geometry, and geometry leads you to certain elements. And this is why Hegel is saying here having arbitrary affiliations with numbers will cause you to lose out on their true meaning. So if you are obsessed with, there was a tragedy that happened yesterday, or on today is July 6th. On July 4th, 2 days ago, there was a tragedy that occurred, and the individual responsible for the tragedy became fixated on the number 47 and its reverse 74, likely because he's part of an organization that is obsessed with this number. And so, in my awareness, I realized that that particular number, while it may have quite a lot of history, just because it's between 1 and 100, and the statistics allow it to have that much history, it also is related to the I Ching, or the Tao Te Ching hexagram system, and the number 47 is affiliated with a particular idea. And the goal of the 60 or so hexagrams was to create the impossible. Lao Tzu, a man, I believe, of Greek heritage who lived in China, or at least who had a Greek understanding, lived in a city in China and decided to leave it. But he was known to have quite a lot of knowledge. And he was held at the gate of the city and said, in the kindest words possible, we're not going to let you leave until you tell us everything you know, or you at least leave us a system to understand it. So what he did was he prepared a series of, I believe the number is 63 hexagrams, and each one represents a form of the Chinese language. And then with each hexagram, he added a certain phrase next to it. Now, his goal was to create the impossible, and the impossible is random. There is no such thing as random. At least there is classically taught that random isn't possible. That random is just really, there is order in it if you know how to find it. But the more permutations you have, and the more difficult it is to gather them from a set of material, from a set of atomic material, the more likely it is that the thing you draw will make you gain the benefit of randomness. And the benefit of randomness is that you help your mind develop more and more ideas. And so within these 63 hexagrams, and that can be broken up in different ways, if you roll them or use his system to acquire them, you can create a sentence based on an activity. So instead of saying that, like, astrology is based on thousands of years of observations that when certain alignments occur, people react certain ways. And over millennia, it seems that in general, people will act a particular way under certain astrological combinations if they themselves were born at a certain astrological combination. And it's just like saying, if 10,000 people meet in a stadium, they will likely all cheer and yell and scream. But if 10 people meet in a stadium, it is very unlikely that they're going to be cheering, yelling, and screaming unless they're part of a cheer team practicing for that purpose. So there are things you can determine. It is likely that if I run, for instance, in university, we would try to get people to appear at our rallies. So our rule was for every single person you wanted to appear, you had to print 10 flyers. So if I wanted 100 people at my event, I printed 1,000 flyers and handed them out, pieces of paper with the information explaining what we were doing. So I would give out 100 of these with the expectation that 1 in 10 of those people who received it would show up. And this number, again, it may be a slightly different number, but this number worked for us. So we would know how many flyers to print. 1 in 10 would show up. If you run your advertisement on Hulu during a certain program, it is very likely that you can increase your sales by 20%, just by running this advertisement on a certain television show in a certain market at a certain time. So these are things that are known and can be done, and they sound as strange as astrology, but they are predictive, and they've been predictive for a long time, as astrology is. The I Ching, the Tao Te Ching, is not that way. The Tao Te Ching is it's Confucian, even though it seems to be against Confucianism. It basically says, Confucianism gives you etiquette. In this situation, you do this. In this situation, talking to this person, you speak this way. Well, with the Tao Te Ching, it assumes you don't have that etiquette. So you have no plans for the day at all. And so you participate in the method of the Tao Te Ching, and you see what shows up. You get hexagram 15 and 17, and you read out what those two things say, and then you try your best within your mental capacity, within your intellectual quotient, to put together your activities for the day, how you plan to approach the world. I don't know what I want to do today. I don't know how I want to feel, how I want to interact with people. Well, let me see. And there is a book that's been made into a television series on Amazon Prime called, the original book is by the author Philip K. Dick. It is The Man in the High Castle. And The Man in the High Castle. And it's said that within the book, an author within the book wrote his entire book by casting, which is called the I Ching, the Tao Te Ching, each day for each chapter, or even in parts of it. So as he was writing his book, he would cast it and read what the Tao said, and then write that, form it into a chapter.
Mars.
And if for some reason he had a question about how to proceed, he would roll it again as an infrasection, let's say, and use that to write the next part. And in doing so, he wrote the entire book using the Tao Te Ching, and it became a very important book and also extremely controversial. And this is within the Man in the High Castle itself. This is what is said to be from one of the characters. Now, why did it become controversial? Well, Lao Tzu, who lived, I want to say, more than 2,000 years ago, he had an understanding of Buddhism as a tradition of psychology. And Buddhism, as a tradition of psychology, based in reading the Hindu doctrine of the Vedas, which go back thousands of years, was able to detect every type of thought a person had been trained to have as they were trained and grew up in a particular family. So it is likely if you grew up in India, which is a very large subcontinent, which is and whose population has spread out across the world, you interact with the world a certain way. And if you bring together 10 people from all four castes within the caste system who are of both genders and within certain age ranges, they will all have a prescribed way of interacting with each other that is well known by a person who studied it. And so the I Ching, or the Tao Te Ching, sits down and has recorded those within the 63 hexagrams and with the ways in which they're broken up. And so if you really are just throwing the hexagram, throwing or casting them, and you write a book from it, you will very likely write out every type of mental situation, every type of social interaction that can be possible for human beings to interact with. And Philip K. Dick, very interested in this type of thing. When you, and I'm, I guess, full disclosure, I am a close friend of his nephew, who is also an author. His name is Ryan Cecil, Cecio, who has a book coming out soon. I hope you look for it. I'm not quite sure of the title. But if you were to throw the I Ching, hopefully by the time you listen, he'll have many books. Ryan Cecil, the nephew, Philip K. Dick. But when you throw this out, when you throw these out there and you write a book that has pretty much every type of thought or that a person could have or situation, then you will find people who read those things and say, how is it that he knows what I'm thinking? And instead of believing, as most people do, that they are unique and special snowflakes, you will notice that they have a pattern to them that can be predicted. And even if the author himself has no idea who you are, it is very likely that he's written a book that speaks to each and every type of person, at least from an Indo-European, Aryan, and to some extent an Northern Indian, Gulf Arab understanding. And since he was in China, it was also very likely that he knew how to add to it the certain Chinese characters, which you find that captured the Chinese. So when he was held at the gate and said, give us all that you know, here's all that I know about you and the rest of the world in these hexagrams. So it is not divination. Well, it is not intended to predict the future. It is intended to tell people, to give people comfort that they are understood. And the way that that's been done throughout our history is that certain people have organized either by watching people and how they naturally are and then categorizing it down, and then we teach that in school, or it is that we are all trained to act a certain way by our age, our place in society, our gender, and other factors. And so when we interact with each other, we're not bored. That we conform to our identity, and in those identities, we bring people together in a society, and they're not bored. Sometimes people of a certain identity come together and interact with each other because they actually are not bored by themselves. They love interacting. So all men of a certain caste and a certain age range get together and have a conversation. They almost all know what they're going to say to each other. But if a woman walks into that room who's younger, it is possible they won't really know how to interact with her. It may feel uncomfortable in her difference, and she may feel uncomfortable in her difference. So it takes someone, in my caste, as I found in genetics, I have one permutation higher of a Kshatriya than as a Brahmin. And so I have a natural ability to go out and discover and also offer methods by which, and offer it through work of organizing people and offering them leadership. But I also have the capacity to teach them ways that they might prefer to act. So instead of just adjusting to the way they act and offering solutions, I can know already how they are meant to act with each other and be a bit more patient in the process. of how they act. So this is a way that if you were to, for instance, so the tragedy that has occurred, the individual chose one of the hexagrams, possibly because his organization focused on it. So they focused all of them on this one hexagram, and they learned it, they figured it out, and that's all they did. And since they only had that one hexagram, they began, in a way, worshiping it without understanding that the goal of that hexagram was that it would show up sometimes to offer an alternative to being, not that you should be it always. So if you use symbols arbitrarily, not knowing why they exist or not being initiated into how to use them and using them that way, then you may find yourself in trouble. In this particular hexagram, if you were to read it correctly, could range from anywhere from providing judgment for a large group of people to how to manage an adulterous spouse. All these things are together in it. If you pull it up, if you happen to pull that up, there's something in there regarding your question. However, if you worship it and cause it to occur, then as a unit, it could lead to some great difficulty. So if you're listening to this and you're an occultist or someone else using a number system, if you're using astrology, astrology has been known to be predictive, and so you can go ahead and use it the way that you, up to the capacity of how you learned it. Speaking as a Kshatriya Brahmin. However, if you're using the Tao Te Ching, the I Ching, which is again from one of my family groups as a multivariate individual, I would warn you that it was never meant that you would take one hexagram, that you would take one tarot card and just use that one as the way you interact with life. You should mix them up. I'll also tell you, though, that some people do use one or two or three, and they form their entire group that way. And once it is found out that that's the one you use, it'll be easier for outsiders to manipulate your group. Encyclopedia section 105, that the quantum in its independent character is external to itself is what constitutes its quality. In that externality, it is itself and referred connectively to itself. There is a union in it of externality. In essence, the quantitative and of independency being for self the qualitative. The quantum, when explicitly put thus in its own self, is the quantitative ratio, a mode of being which, while in its exponent it is an independent quantum, is also mediation, viz., or by reflection of, the reference of some one quantum to another, forming the two sides of the ratio. But the two quanta are not reckoned at their immediate value. Their value is only in this relation. The quantitative infinite progression appears at first as a continual extrusion of number beyond itself. On looking closer, it is, however, apparent that in this progression, quantity returns to itself. For the meaning of this progression, so far as thought goes, is the fact that number is determined by number. And this gives the quantitative ratio. Take, for example, the ratio 2 to 4. Here we have two magnitudes, not counted in their several immediate values, in which we are only concerned with their mutual relations. This relation of the two terms, the exponent of the ratio, is itself a magnitude, 2 to the second power, distinguished from the related magnitudes by this, that a change in it is followed by a change of the ratio, whereas the ratio is unaffected by the change of both its sides and remains the same as long as the exponent is not changed. Consequently, in place of 2 to 4, we can put 3 to 6 without changing the ratio, as the exponent 2 remains the same in each case. That Encyclopedia section 105 would be a very good number question, or a good practice for legal exams, and of course for legal examinations, because there is what Hegel is saying here is that number is number is number. Though the ratio 2 to 4, well, it is true that 2 squared is 4. 2 to the second power is 4. 2 times 2 is 4. Or 2 2s is 4, I guess you would say. So 2 to the second power is 4. But if you put 3 6, is 3 to the second power 6? No. So he's saying here, even though 2 to the second power is 4, it's really 2 times 2 that's 4 that we're looking at, and 3 times 2 is 6. So if you ask the student to continue writing a number line of ratios, and you throw out there the information, oh yeah, 2 squared is 4, that piece of information, while true, is not useful to create a number line. That's 2 to 4, 3 to 6, 4 to 8, 5 to 10. If you wanted to create one that was squared, it would be 2 squared equals 4, 3 squared equals 9, 4 squared equals 16. And you would be able to grade people differently in their understanding of mathematics that way. And it's very common to throw in something of that nature. And here's an arbitrary usage of a number, because this is Encyclopedia section 105. If you agree that 0 is only relevant to elevate the place where we're at, there have been 105 paragraphs, and you remove it, you get the number 15. Knowing that this was written in the early 1800s. Sorry for so many number references, but now that's the year we're talking about. And that Hegel has mentioned certain secret groups. One thing, and I've mentioned it already as well, the tarot. I would know that a person who mentions certain secret groups and tells people not to use them arbitrarily may have some usage of it in his writing. And so the number 15 references a certain tarot trump, which is the devil. And the devil is a trickster. And so it's not that what he's saying to you is false, or it's not that what he's saying to I'll skip all that so I don't become such a trickster. You should know that there is something false about the explanation. Not that you can't get an answer, but so I can challenge you more, there's something false here. So he references, and he doesn't say to the second power, but he references it to the next degree, to the next power. So 2 to the second power is 4. However, 3 to the second power isn't 6. And if you only have, let's say, 2 minutes to do this problem, and I need to distinguish between two students, who gets the A plus and who gets the A, if the person who knows, who gets there faster, so create this number line, creates the correct number line, recognizing the trick implicit in it, he or she will be the victor. And the other individual would not be, because they were focused on an element. Zenith. They were focusing on an element of truth. Here, the ratio 2 to 4, and not necessarily where it was headed. And so throughout this text, there are number references. And for those who are engaged in esoteric study, you will find as the encyclopedia sections increase, some of them intentionally reflect the tarot, but not all of them. So if you go through each of these trying to make a tarot application to it, you won't find it in each one. However, here, I think there is an intention to do it here because Encyclopedia section 15 also had a similar trick in it. It may be, and so it may be that 1050 has one as well, if there is such a number, which I don't believe there is. So this is one thing to consider, but it may be that 8 or 80 or 800, which isn't here, isn't about adjustment or isn't about that particular card. So you may be looking at it and trying to find it and it not be there. A piece of fact for someone who may be looking for it. Encyclopedia section 106. The two sides of the ratio are still immediate quanta, and the qualitative and quantitative characteristics still external to one another, but in their truth, seeing that the quantitative itself in its externality is relation to self, or seeing that the independence and the indifference of the character are combined, it is measure. Thus, quantity, by means of the dialectical movement, so far studied through its several stages, turns out to be a return to quality. The first notion of quantity presented to us was that of quality abrogated and absorbed. That is to say, quantity seemed an external character not identical with being, to which it is quite immaterial. This notion, as we have seen, underlies the mathematical definition of magnitude as what can be increased or diminished. At first sight, this definition may create the impression that quantity is merely whatever can be altered, increase and diminution alike implying determination of magnitude otherwise, and may tend to confuse it with the determinate being the second stage of quality, which in its notion is similarly conceived as alterable. We can, however, complete the definition by adding, that in quantity we have an alterable which, in spite of alterations, still remains the same. The notion of quantity, it thus turns out, implies an inherent contradiction. This contradiction is what forms the dialectic of quantity. The result of the dialectic, however, is not a mere return to quality, as if that were the true and quantity the false notion, but an advance to the unity and truth of both, to qualitative quantity or measure. It may be well, therefore, at this point to observe that whenever in our study of the objective world we are engaged in quantitative determinations, it is in all cases measure which we have in view as the goal of our operation. That this is hinted at even in language when the ascertainment of quantitative features and relations is called measuring. We measure, ergo, the length of different chords that have been put into a state of vibration with an eye to the qualitative difference of the tones caused by their vibration corresponding to this difference of length. The Platonic solids are referenced there. Similarly, in chemistry, we try to ascertain the quantity of the matters brought into combination in order to find out the measures or proportions conditioning such combinations. That is to say, those quantities which give rise to definite qualities. In statistics, too, the numbers with which the study is engaged are important only from the qualitative results conditioned by them. Mere collection of numerical facts, prosecuted without regard to the ends here noted, is justly called an exercise of idle curiosity, of neither theoretical nor practical interest. Encyclopedia section 107, measure is the qualitative quantum. In the first place, as immediate, a quantum to which a determinate being or a quality is attached. Let me offer at this point an explanation of word combination. So we're talking about chemistry here. If you take two parts of hydrogen and add them to one part of oxygen, you get the element water. But if it is just hydrogen, you have a gas. The most fundamental gas, at least in our solar system, possibly our galaxy, and maybe even the universe, you have hydrogen. And hydrogen, for many people, is considered a permutation of God Himself, the very basic core of all things. However, when hydrogen is added to itself, you've done like the ratio 1 to 2. So now you have two parts of the same thing. And so you have hydroxide, which may have a different usage on its own, two parts hydrogen. But when you add oxygen to it, we then have the quality of water. So within the studies of the Platonic solids and the elementals, you would say you have two parts ether added to one part of earth. And the two parts of ether added to the one part of earth change themselves into the quality that you would have of water, of wetness or water. And so you put those together, and that's what you have. And so when you have a word like sunset, you have something like hydrogen. But when you have a word like magnificent sunset, then you have two parts of hydrogen. But when you say the brown-hued magnificent sunset, then you have something like H2O of water. And whenever you add a quantitative word to a quality, you remove the quality from its essential nature and demote it to something lesser than itself. But by adding a quantity to it, but even though it is lesser than itself, it offers us language and the ability to record what it is. So, sunset. All right, so you write down in your journal sunset. Okay, that was great. The sun sets daily, at least in most parts of the world. There are parts of the world where the sun doesn't set for long periods of the year, and where it does, where it doesn't rise for long periods of the year in the extreme north and south. So great, there was a sunset. That's the quality that you observed. However, if you say quick sunset, then we know that the sun fell below the horizon very quickly, as you will find in, say, if you go to Thailand or near the equator, the sun sets very quickly. Okay, so if the sun set quickly, I think I know where you are. I think I know that you are near the equator. That's important to me that you described a fast or quick sunset, you're near to the equator. If you then say quick, magnificent sunset, I know that you're likely in an area where the air quality is very good. So maybe you're on an island near the equator watching the sunset, or you're on a mountaintop near the equator watching the sunset. So even though the concept of sunset, this universal, has been demoted by your word quick, it gives us something important that we can know. This is measure. So when you add a word to another, when you add a quality, when you add a quantity to a quality, it falls from being universal, but it allows us to know something that we otherwise would not have known about the person or the entity offering that quantitative measure of equality. So I go through this and I speak about it at length because some people were listening. If this is all you ever listen to about metaphysics, I want to present something different to you than I learned, which is a positivist, let's say, approach to using all of this language, which is what I'm gaining or gleaning from Hegel. Instead of just saying, well, you diminished quality by adding a quantitative a quantity to it, and by measure, how dare you measure God's creation? I dare, because in some of his books, he says he praises those who record it and transmit it to others. So record what you see here, the book of Revelation would say, and transmit it to others. So you may say, I saw heaven upon the earth, or you may say, and its walls were made of single beryl or single pearl or single diamonds. And that's what, and that's the quantity of the quality heaven. And it seems to be, since we're talking about truth and God being the same, important to express the quality and to offer a means by which to measure it. And that's just why I would do it. So I'm presenting a positive approach. You may find yourself in a situation where a person has learned to only highlight quality, and any attempts to describe that quality are considered demotions of the quality, and any demotion for some people are considered a loss of face or negative or insulting when you demote them. So this is a method of speaking. Do your best to listen to the qualities that they offer you. They may have, they may be able to express quality and describe quality that you don't gain by someone who quantifies quality. So know quality and the different ways in which it is expressed from the person who won't demote quality, and then find the person who will allow you to measure or to create measure by quantifying the quality. I once said to a man, look how beautiful the sunset is. And he said to me, I can't see color. Whether it was color blindness or something else, or I don't see it, I think he said. And from a philosophical, he was a very intelligent person who worked in computers. From a philosophical standpoint, I was really offended by this for some strange reason. And then I became very concerned that he couldn't see this beauty, and came up with all types of theories about him and what it meant, and what kind of person he might be. But it may be that in reality, he didn't want to demote the concept of sunset on a warm spring evening. Or maybe, sunset also can reference someone dying or the end of something. I was leaving position at that point. Maybe he was concerned about that. So he may have expressed something without adding a quantity to it. So just know that measure is a quantitative quality, but it is a demotion from the universal. And so there are times when people don't want you to use quantity. And this is why poetry, for instance, it is said of the Islamic prophet. This work here, as I mentioned before, it seems to reference a book very popular within the Gnostic or esoteric community of the Middle East, which is often either Jewish or Islamic, some aspects of Christianity as well. It is said that the Islamic prophet Muhammad didn't speak in poetry, and that poetry was not appropriate for him. It wasn't equal to him. He only spoke in universals. He only spoke in qualitative statements. None of his statements offered quantity. There's a saying, either is in the Quran or another tradition, that says, they ask you about the nature of the soul. Say to them, the soul is of the affairs of my Lord. About it, I have been given permission to say but a little. So then he offers some quantity there, but we have no idea what a little is in that point. This is important because we're going to go on and to express philosophy, to express some aspects of prose or poetry. It is important to add an adjective, to add a quantity to a universal. And do your best not to diminish the universal at the same time, or be prepared for the reaction you'll gain for saying, I believe in God, but only at Christmas and Mother's Day. And someone will say, well, why would you demote God to 2 days of the year? And they may become very angry with that, and you need to then determine, do you want to engage someone's anger, or do you want to revise your statement? It is important to know the etiquette of speaking in philosophy, because you could cause yourself a material harm if you speak about it inappropriately. Though you could cause yourself intellectual harm if you prevent yourself from thinking about it in all the ways that you've learned to. So returning to Encyclopedia section 107, measure is the qualitative quantum. In the first place, as immediate, a quantum to which a determinate being or a quality is attached. Measure, where quality and quantity are in one, is thus the completion of being. Being, as we first apprehended, is something utterly abstract and characterless. But it is the very essence of being to characterize itself, and its complete characterization is reached in measure. Measure, like the other stages of being, may serve as a definition of the absolute. God, it has been said, is the measure of all things. It is this idea which forms the ground note of many of the ancient Hebrew hymns, in which the glorification of God tends in the main to show that He has appointed to everything its bound. To the sea and to the solid land, to the rivers and the mountains, and also to the various kinds of plants and animals. To the religious sense of the Greeks, the divinity of measure, especially in respect of social ethics, was represented by Nemesis, or Nimis, Nimes. And Nimes is a particular concept within an Egyptian philosophy. Nemesis is understood a bit differently these days. The conception implies a general theory that all human things, riches, honor, and power, as well as joy and pain, have their definite measure, the transgression of which brings ruin and brings ruin and destruction. In the world of objects, too, we have measure. We see in the first place existences in nature of which measure forms the essential structure. This is the case, for example, with the solar system, which may be described as the realm of free measures. As we next proceed to the study of inorganic nature, measure retires, as it were, into the background. At least we often find the quantitative and qualitative characteristics showing indifference to each other. Thus, the quality of a rock or a river is not tied to a definite magnitude. But even these objects, when closely inspected, are found not to be quite measureless. The water of a river and the single constituents of a rock, when chemically analyzed, are seen to be qualities conditioned by the quantitative ratios between the matters they contain. In organic nature, however, measure again rises full into immediate perception. The various kinds of plants and animals, in the whole as well as in their parts, have a certain measure, though it is worth noticing that the more imperfect forms, those which are least removed from inorganic nature, are partly distinguished from the higher forms by the greater indefiniteness of their measure. Thus, among fossils, we find some ammonites discernible only by the microscope, and others as large as a cartwheel. The same vagueness of measure appears in several plants, which stand on a low level of organic development, for instance, ferns. I'm going to use a baking example here. Uh, so, bread. I've been looking on YouTube for simple bread recipes. Someone gave me a bag of flour, and I'm not used to cooking from scratch yet, so I wanted to know what I can make from flour just itself. And there are these recipes which say take the flour, let's say it's ground up wheat, and again, most purpose flour has some different elements to it and things how it's made up. But let's say it's ground wheat. I'm taking ground wheat and I want to make bread. So it says take the ground wheat, add water to it, and then pour in Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has different concepts that have yeast and other things within itself already pre-prepared. So you put that together, you put it aside, and let the dough expand outward, just as we were discussing, mercury rising. Let the molecules, which are warming up, separate from each other, and then kind of sit back into themselves, and you'll have something more expansive that when you heat it in the oven will continue to expand and form itself into a bread. Now, if you want cake, you can take that same flour and you would add more elements, a half teaspoon of salt, a cup of sugar, a certain amount of water, and butter and cream and flavoring. Let's say you'll add peach flavoring to it, and you mix all this together, again, in a certain model or mold, put it in the oven, let it bake and rise, let it cool, and then you'll put it in the refrigerator and let it become icy and take a more congealed form. So the measure So this thing, if you would cut a slice of it and put it under a microscope or a mass spectrometer, you should be able to determine what is in it and what the measures are, how they measure against each other. And this thing here is considered complex. And just like some people only prefer the universal, and its singularity, some people prefer only the complex. The more things in it, the more it is valued. So this cake, someone would value over bread because they would consider, so bread would be something generally more universal, cake would be something less universal, and depending on your perspective, whether you were more inclined towards quality or quantity, you would have a preference for either one. Maybe you like both, but in different situations. But this is a way to look at proportion and measurement and how perception is achieved, and the different ways we can then use words to describe them.